Hello and welcome to episode 42 of the Fertility Rewire podcast. It's been a few weeks since I've released a podcast episode. Apologies about that if you were waiting for one. But I took some time off over Christmas. I do like to practice as I preach, and I just felt that I just needed to step back from everything that was going on. I'm working with clients and, keeping my practice and everything else going. And it was just the additional bits and pieces that I just decided to step away from and take a break. And so I had quite an extended Christmas break, and with the onset of home learning again, and there being many people in my house receiving online lessons, which sounds like I'm in a school itself, I just wanted to take a little bit of time. Anyway, so here I am on episode 43, and I'm going to be talking to you in this episode about the uterine lining, which is completely overlooked in many, many ways. It's something that you might hear about more if you're having assisted fertility methods, but I'm going to share with you why some of the parameters there are perhaps a little bit low based on recent research. And just about what you need to know about this crucial part of fertility and reproduction. I hope you enjoy. Hello and welcome to the Fertility Rewire podcast, a place for information and discussion around topics relevant to fertility. I'm your host, Kat Stevens. I'm a fertility coach and founder of the Fertility Rewire program, and I'm passionate about people being given sufficient information to enhance their own fertility awareness. So in today's podcast, I'm going to talk about something that I cover a lot when I'm working with clients, with couples, with people trying to conceive, whether that be by conventional methods or whether that be by assisted methods. And that is about the uterus. A really, really significant part of the process, obviously, but one that I think isn't really looked at sufficiently and is clearly key. And it comes back to what I'm often talking about, in that we need to be looking a little bit further than egg and sperm. Now, yes, of course, the uterus is looked at in terms of tests that you may have, and by that we mean the ultrasound that is performed. So it's very minimal in that sense. And also, you've heard me talk about tests before. Tests are undertaken after a significant amount of waiting, by which time your stress and emotions may be heightened, and you may be waiting for an answer, for an indication of why you're not getting pregnant. But actually, the limits of these tests are, the parameters are very, very narrow, and the tests really are to rule out anything significant. But even if we're noticing anything significant, that may go on to surgery or other treatment. But really, these tests are to signpost you to the most appropriate assisted fertility treatment for you. And I think that earlier on, this education should be given, as I've said many, many times before, about nutrition, about the DNA, the fragmentation risks, about, the life cycle of sperm and 90 to 120 days, and eggs. Yes, although they are within us when we're born, we can help them in the maturation process. So back to the uterus then. I think the thing for me is that really, as I've said, this information should be given before you're trying to conceive, to understand a little bit more and to move away from that element of finding out what's wrong. In terms of the ultrasound, which may have shown that things are normal, I think it's important to consider quite a few other factors. So the position of the uterus can be key. You may have been told that you have a retroverted or anteverted uterus. So it's tilting either forwards or backwards. You may have been told that this has got, in no way will this affect your fertility. And when you look into the information about this, it does say it shouldn't affect your fertility. But when we look at reasons why there may be I'm going to say tilted because it's easier, a tilted uterus, there are lots of factors that could potentially lead into this. So, scarring or adhesions, which might be from trauma, might be from a previous birth, it might be from an infection, a pelvic, a pelvic infection. It might be due to the space, due to postural implications, and I'll refer you to the episode that I did with Claire Mockridge when we were looking as to the amount of room and space that your uterus has. And I think we talked in that about if you were trying to do your job from behind a wardrobe, how effective would you be? And that space in the pelvic bowl is really key. Also, when you think about the potential ligaments obviously involved as well, if there's any issues with constipation and, like a permanently full rectum that's pushing things out of the way, if you're sitting with a very tilted posture, if you're sitting prolonged, and increasingly I'm finding that people that I'm working with are reporting more lower back pain. I've always had people that would report lower back pain, but I'm seeing a much higher incidence of this now. And when we think about home working, so one of my many hats through my lifetime is as an ergonomist. So a big part of my job at some point was doing industrial assessments and workstation assessments, looking at postures that people are adopting. So this is much more than a good chair, shall we say. We look at how you're setting up your workstation. I was chatting to someone just the other day about their workstation and how that is part of now my fertility consultation when we're looking at their back and supporting the lower back. And that also has an impact on the circulation and the nerve supply to the uterus. So that lower back area is the nerve root there is going to supply the uterus, and the blood supply is passing through that area as well. So it's really, really important that that area is working correctly. And if you've got pain, then there is an indication there that something is not right. And it's important to get that looked at. I point my clients, when we're working together and the resources that I provide to them, to a specific a morning yoga routine. It's a short yoga routine. And when I say yoga, it's not the yoga poses you may know about. It's more about connection and just working that lower back and that pelvic space, which is a really, really useful addition to your practices that you're doing. When we look at the circulation to the uterus, if we're looking at a thin lining, and if you're trying to conceive naturally, you might not be aware of a thickness of a lining. If you've been through any IVF or potentially IUI procedures, you may be aware of comments or recording of the thickness of the lining. And generally, what is advised is that a thickness of the lining for implantation, for transfer of embryo, should be greater than 7 millimeters. Now, that doesn't mean you can't get pregnant with a lining less than 7 millimeters, because people have got pregnant with less. But generally speaking, to improve your chances of that thick, receptive, nourishing lining, you'd be looking at greater than 7 millimeters. But research as recent as 2018 has shown that when you are looking at a lining of greater than 9 to 10 millimeters, or at least 9 to 10 millimeters, there is a higher chance of successful IVF. Now, obviously, this is monitored in IVF because it can be controlled in terms of the times and when implantation is occurring. But obviously that same principle would apply to conception in a non-assisted way. So things that can impact a thinner lining are a reduced blood flow to the uterus. So there might be postural implications. There may have been things that have happened in surgeries, particularly in cesarean, and if there have been hemorrhage postpartum, if it was if you're now trying for subsequent children and you've had a pregnancy and a birth already, there may be issues there. Fibroids can actually lead to a thin uterine lining, and as I've said before, adhesions from possible trauma or infection. And there are other reasons around fertility in terms of fallopian tube defects, and they can have an effect on the lining. A lower estrogen or estrogen, depending on your pronunciation, is often at play as well in terms of a thin lining. But also when it comes to lining, we don't want to be thinking or having, how can I explain this? So when you have IVF, just to explain first of all, when you have IVF, the hormones, the synthetic hormones and the processes are being done in place of a non-assisted cycle. So you are given drugs to down-regulate, so it kind of switches the normal function of the reproductive and hormonal system off. And then other drugs are used to simulate the cycle. So you're given this down-regulation, then you'll have your bleed as normal, theoretically, although the timing can be different. And then during your bleed, after your bleed, you are scanned to see what your lining is, and you don't start your stimulation treatment to stimulate eggs and thicken your lining until that lining is of a very, very thin quality and that it has cleared. So that should be happening at the end of your bleed naturally. So you have your period and then your lining is shed. If the lining isn't completely shed, if it's not always shed, then your next lining is built on top of that and built on top of that. So it is important for a really good clearing during your bleed. Now, your ability to clear, if you like, so when you're having your period can be affected by the position of your uterus. It might have to work really, really hard because gravity is a little bit against it to remove the blood. You might not remove all the blood at the end of your period, and you might find that you get some mid-cycle spotting potentially. And if that's old blood, then that gives an indication that the clearing hasn't happened. And I refer you to the podcast episode about endometriosis, where I talk about a case study there and how the lady that I was working with, through the work we were doing, actually she had this huge bleed that was black and almost like tar, and that she had grade 4 endometriosis, and that was such a significant clearing after the work and the self-work that she'd done. And then she got pregnant after that big clearing bleed. So it is important to look at your period, to look at your bleed, the colour, the consistency, the length, and to get some indication. And I will point you in the direction of the I have a free resource available on my website, and I'll put it in the show notes, what your bleed says about your fertility. So that can give you some indication. So circulation is important, hormones are important, position is important, and please do be aware of any lower back issues or pelvic issues and how you're sitting. But I want you to take a moment and just think about your uterus or womb or whatever words you would use for that area of your body. This is where you are planning to grow your baby. So that thick, receptive, nourishing, in IVF circles, we would talk about the triple layer of the lining. It would be nourishing. It's a nest. It's a nest. It's a place where your baby will grow. It's a place to nourish. It's a place to nurture. It's a place to prepare. if you think about birds getting their nest ready for their eggs, the care and attention to make everything right, to have it in the right place, to have the right lining, to add, bits of fur that they find to the nest to keep it nice and warm. They really like the furry layer on the outside of my palm tree that I have in the garden. They pick that away to line their nests, and it's the same for you. So take some time to think about that area of your body. Think about that mind and body connection. This may be an area of your body that has let you down. And I wrote a blog post quite some time ago now, which was a letter from your womb. I will share that as well. And it basically, I was imagining that your womb would be talking to you and saying that, yes, she feels this pain every month. She feels the pain of not being able to do the job that she was designed to do. But she can only do what she can do with what she's given. And so to start to think of the two of you as if they're separate entities working together, you're both wanting the same thing. So let's look at this preparation. Let's look at this connection with that area. And, a lot of the people that I'm working with, we do, when I work with people, I work with the physical and the emotional. And I don't believe you can separate the two. There are emotional factors that will affect whether you apply the physical changes. There are emotional factors that cause the physical changes. There are emotional factors in themselves that we need to kind of not always dig into. This has come up this week with a couple I'm working with. We don't have to dig into that all of the time. It can be strategies and methods to help you work through, to reduce that emotional load, to give you more of a strength. And not that you will switch into this positive frame, not that you will suddenly feel positive and bright about everything, but that you become more open to a sense, if you like, to a sense of trusting your body to do ultimately what it is designed to do. Now, I know that there is an element of choice and we can choose not to become pregnant, but when we want to become pregnant, it is working with the body to support it. I've given the analogy of a nest, but think of your car. Your car isn't going to run correctly without the right fuel, without being serviced, without being looked after. It's so important that this area of the body we nurture. You can listen to the podcast episode about fertility massage therapy as well. This comes up, and reflexology, this comes up a lot in the podcast discussions. It is a huge part of the work that I'm doing, and that connection is really, really important. So in the deep dive sessions that I do, so whatever work I do with anybody, we often start with a free call, and then if we're going to work together, if that is needed after that call, we would always do the deep dive session, because until we know what's going on physically and emotionally, I can't say, oh, you'll need this or that or the other. But in the deep dive session, we find out lots. We work on the physical, we work on the emotional, and then afterwards, with the resources that I provide my clients, we cover acupressure point work that you would deliver yourself, some self-massage, so the fertility massage delivered to yourself, cover aspects of self-care, particularly those that would support that clearing of the lining and of an old lining. Because when you're on your bleed, if you think about it, you are clearing out the old and getting ready for the new. And that's the same emotionally at that time. If you tune into that cyclic emotions that you experience, we ebb and flow. I also point people towards a specific daily yoga practice. And also added in some other, if you do like yoga and you want to take that a little bit further, there's some other resources as well. But then to work with that emotional aspect, and one of the recorded visualizations that I offer to my clients is one where you can start to connect with the control room, if you like, in terms of reproduction. There's lots of nuances and metaphors and things in there to bring in with the visualization, but to work on that lining and to have that image of the lining. So what I would advise you to do, maybe not now, depending on what you're doing, but when you have a moment, just pop your hands. Pop, you can tell I used to be a nurse. Nurses use pop all the time. Place your hands on your lower abdomen. Just connect with that space. What comes up for you? What thoughts are you having about this space? What thoughts do you have towards your uterus, towards your reproductive system when you get your period as you're approaching ovulation? Because the physical is key, the emotional is key, and the combination of them both is huge. So I invite you to think about this space as a nest, to think about any indicators that might be present that I've talked about today, and have a look at the resources that I've pointed you to. This is a hugely important part of the process. You could have top quality eggs, top quality sperm. That is important. I say quality. Did you notice there? Not quantity. You could have absolutely top quality basic ingredients, but the nest is crucial. I'd love to hear your thoughts if you have any, so you can comment in the available places on the various platforms, or you could send me an email at kat@fertilityrewire.com. If you wanted to book a free call, as always, the link is on the website. But I really hope that's been useful, and I invite you to just take a moment. Are you overlooking this crucial area? Take care. You've been listening to the Fertility Rewire podcast with me, Kat Stevens. If you wanted to find any further details, then you can check out the website, fertilityrewire.com, or find me on Instagram or Facebook or Pinterest at Fertility Rewire.